only two types of people in this world: people who live in California and people who wish they lived in California. I am proud to be a Southern Californian through and through. I mean, like you guys, I even have the accent. Few of you have actually probably heard it. But when I hang out with other fast-talking, high-energy Southern Californians, especially those from the Valley, it really starts to come out. And I'm not just a fast talker, I'm also pretty loud, so I'm hopeful that I can project today. Another stereotypical Californian trait of mine is that I am very intimidated of driving in the rain. Now, I am a staunch defender of my fellow Californians. At least part of the reason why we are terrible at driving in the rain is our infrastructure. Our roads do not drain. Our canyons dump mud and rocks on the roads that are extra hazards. It is not all our fault. But we're also bad at driving in the rain. I mean, I could merge onto the freeway like a pro before I even got my learner's permit, but I was in my early 20s before I even saw an actual rainstorm. It was when Nate and I were living in Uganda after we graduated from Pepperdine. Climate change has significantly affected the dry and wet seasons in that region of Africa, which used to function like clockwork, so we did not know to expect the first storm when it came. It was the middle of the night, and I shot up in bed with the first loud bang. It sounded like a battering ram was being used against our giant metal front door. Before I paused to even think about it, I leapt out of bed to check all of the windows and doors in our apartment to make sure they were secure. And then the rain came. It started pelting our metal roof like our apartment building had been moved under a giant waterfall. I had never seen or heard anything like it before. When the lightning shot across the sky, I got a glimpse of the rain coming down in a sheet, but it was difficult to make out much else. I could feel the thunder rumbling through my bones. I was mystified and terrified and so glad to be indoors. Nate slept through the whole thing, by the way. Storms make us feel powerless and small. They remind us that there is no amount of will or might that can stop the weather. And as the climate crisis continues to make all types of storms worse all around the globe, our safety and preparedness measures will continue to prove inadequate. Think of Texas's winter storm Uri, also known as Snowmageddon, in 2021. Power was out for more than 2 weeks. At least 300 people died, and it caused $25 billion in damage. Hurricane Ian in 2022 caused twice as much property damage, at least $50 billion, and it left more than 150 people dead. And Ian wasn't even as deadly as some of the other worst storms of the decade in the United States, storms like Maria and Harvey and Irma. Our apartment in Uganda was a cozy refuge against an ordinary equatorial storm, but it wouldn't have stood a chance against even a mild coastal hurricane. Storms are terrifying. They have the power to destroy in minutes what may have taken years to build, whether that's a structure or a city or a life. Whenever storms hit while we were in Uganda, I remember thinking with reverence, God's power is like a storm. When it is on display, it is petrifying and incomprehensible. God's voice is like thunder. When it booms, it cannot be ignored. God's will is like lightning. It is clear and illuminating and can strike down anything in its path if it chooses. There are times in the Bible when storms are used as a metaphor for God. God can be a storm, And storms reveal something to us about who God is, just like every other facet of nature. But God's power isn't primarily like a storm. God's power more often is like a servant, one who washes feet and weeps with grief and refuses to cast a stone. And God's voice isn't primarily like thunder. God's voice more often is like a breeze, a whisper, a caress against our cheek. And God's will isn't primarily like lightning. God's will more often is like a shepherd who nudges along and knows the way to greener pastures and brings us back when we wander off. The kingdom of God does not pummel us like a torrent of water. The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, a buried treasure, a rare pearl. Whenever the Bible does imagine God as a storm, it is evil and injustice that are destroyed by the storm's might and power. Far, far more often, when the Bible talks about storms, both literally and metaphorically, God is the refuge from the storm, not the storm itself. Before we go back to our story for today in Mark, I want to draw our attention to the first lines of the first chapter of the first book of the Bible, Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Before God says or does anything, the poem paints a picture of the Spirit of God hovering over the surface of the deep. Genesis describes these waters as tohu vabohu, confusion and emptiness, disorder and waste. My favorite translation of tohu vabohu is a little farther from literal, but I think it best captures the imagery of the phrase and of the poem as a whole. Chaotic nothingness. Could you imagine anything worse than chaotic nothingness? Not just chaos and not just nothingness, but chaotic nothingness. An emptiness that confuses and obfuscates, a wasteland that not only has no meaning, but it is disorderly and discombobulating too. That is tohu vabohu. Whenever those equatorial storms hit, while we were sleeping in our apartment in Gingertown, I always wondered what it was like to be someone who lives in a hut in a rural village during a midnight storm. Wondering if your crops would make it to morning, hoping your roof held out for a little while longer. I bet at times, for many people in rural areas of Uganda, storms make them feel like there is only tohu vabohu. Because of the geographical locations where the different parts of the Bible were written, biblical storms tend to refer to tumultuous waters, especially the waters of the sky and of the seas. But other types of storms might help us flesh out our understanding of the chaotic nothingness of tohu vabohu. I finished a book recently called Endurance about the 1914 British expedition across Antarctica. When snow blizzards hit the crew of the Endurance, they had literally nothing and no one to rely on but themselves, which wasn't much. They sat soaked and shivering in their tents, far from home, hoping the ice held out. For them, at times, there was only tohu vabohu. Or imagine getting caught in a sandstorm in the middle of the desert. Imagine being pelted with grains of sand that are like tiny razors against your skin. No matter where you turn, you can see nothing but swirling dust. There is no oasis to save you. There is only tohu vabohu. If we really wanted to stretch our imaginations, we could imagine the great red spot, the storm on planet Jupiter that is plenty big enough to engulf the entire Earth and that has raged for at least 400 years with no signs of slowing. On Jupiter, there isn't even any land to stabilize us. If we got caught in the great red spot, there would only be tohu vabohu. I bet the disciples were feeling like there was only tohu vabohu as they tried to stay afloat on the Sea of Galilee. They couldn't see any hint of a harbor. All was pitch black and water was coming in from every direction. They didn't know if they were going to make it. This storm was all they could think about in this moment. Tohu vabohu, chaotic nothingness. Let's read the story again, as is told in Mark 4, verses 35 to 41, this time from the ESV. Jesus said to the disciples, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And the disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And Jesus awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Jesus said to the disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" In Genesis, in the midst of the tohu vabohu, God speaks, "Let there be light." And there was light. Just a word from God was all that was needed to calm the storm. A cosmic storm at the beginning of time? Of course God intervened then. But what about this pretty ordinary storm on this pretty ordinary night, on this pretty ordinary lake suffered by some pretty ordinary folks? Well, God intervenes now too. Except it is not the Spirit of God that hovers over the tohu vabohu. It is Jesus, napping on a cushion. And it is not the voice of the Creator that quiets the tohu vabohu. It is the voice of the Christ saying, "Peace, be still." Who is this? The disciples asked, amazed that even the tohu vabohu obeys him. It's a rhetorical question, of course, because the answer is obvious, even if difficult to believe. This is the same God as the one in the book of Genesis who hovered over the tohu vabohu at the beginning of time and brought order out of confusion. This is the same God as the one in the book of Exodus who parted the tohu vabohu and allowed God's people to pass safely through the Red Sea. This is the same God as the one in the book of Psalms who has the power both to hold back and to release the great destructive force of the tohu vabohu. This is the same God as the one in the book of Jonah who demonstrated sovereignty over the tohu vabohu by sending and then saving Jonah from the storm. This is the same God as the one in the book of Isaiah who is a refuge from the tohu vabohu, a shelter from the rain, a foundation for the storm-tossed, a comfort for the weary, and a stronghold against violence. And this is just a small sampling of the examples in the Bible of the God who has the power to calm storms. Who then is this? That even the tohu vabohu obeys him? Why, this is the same God that we have always known. The four Gospels, the biographies of Jesus' life that are in the Bible, actually tell two stories of Jesus in a storm. Mark, Matthew, and Luke all tell this story that we are reading for today, where Jesus wakes up from a nap to calm the tohu vabohu. Mark, Matthew, and John also tell another story about Jesus calming the storm. In this second story, Jesus again hovers over the tohu vabohu, this time not napping, but walking on the water, out to the disciples' boat in the middle of the storm. In that story, one of the disciples, Peter, tries to walk on the water with Jesus. He is able to for a moment, but then the tohu vabohu overwhelms him and he begins to sink before Jesus catches him and again commands the storm to be still. Jesus' ability to calm the tohu vabohu was so significant that all four gospel writers included at least one of the stories. That is no small thing. It is very rare for stories to be told that consistently across the four accounts of Jesus' life. That means that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John all agree that storms tell us something significant about who Jesus is. The four accounts of Jesus' life were written and circulated several decades after his ministry. By that time, there were many Christian communities across the Mediterranean, and they experienced a lot of persecution, often brutal persecution at the hands of the Roman Empire. Many of these Christ followers were probably on the brink of despair, if not already in its depths. What's the point of following this Jesus of peace and gentleness when all we are met with is violence and death? I bet there were times when those early Christ followers felt like there was only tohu vabohu. Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels to affirm and encourage these early disciples of Jesus. So when Jesus quiets the storms, it is not just an astounding miracle. It is a statement about who gives life meaning, who is ultimately in control, who gets to define power and justice, peace and order. No matter how uncontrollable, how powerful, how endless the storm may seem, Jesus had power over the tohu vabohu that these early Christians faced. And Jesus continues to have power over the tohu vabohu that disciples of Jesus face today. Independently of each other, Eric and I both have paintings in our offices that depict these two stories of Jesus in storms. In his office, Eric has a print of the 1854 painting by Eugene Delacroix that imagines all of the disciples' different reactions to being in the first storm with Jesus. A couple have thrown their arms up in despair. A few are clutching at the oars and the rudder, trying to take control of the boat and of the storm themselves. Another is clinging to the boat as if it will keep him safe from the storm. And one disciple is napping next to Jesus in the midst of the tohu vabohu. In my office, I have a print of the 2019 digital painting by our very own Nate Barton. This one depicts Jesus walking on the water toward the disciples during the second storm. Again, the disciples are just trying to make it out alive. They are not yet aware that the Lord of creation is present and watching and preparing to intervene. What thoughts and emotions might have been going through the disciples' minds at this moment, just before they noticed Jesus coming toward them in the midst of the tohu vabohu? Even for those of us who are like me, who don't have much experience with actual storms, we are all familiar with the metaphorical storms of life. The tohu vabohu, the chaotic nothingness that haunts this broken world. A mental health crisis, a marriage on the rocks, a toxic work environment, a surprise medical diagnosis, a profound moral failure, a sudden financial hardship. Storms, both literal and symbolic, make us feel powerless and small. They remind us that there is no amount of human will or might that can stop the tohu vabohu. When people come to visit Malibu, especially if they get weather that's unlike today's, it can be difficult for them to imagine anyone experiencing unhappiness or chaos in this beautiful, peaceful place. Those of us who live here know better. There is tohu vabohu everywhere on this planet. And this place, as special as it is, despite its appearance of paradise, is no exception. Tohu vabohu is in this church and on this campus and in this city. Faith communities, for all their goodness, are broken. Institutions, for all their structure, are broken. The world, for all its beauty and belovedness, is broken. The tohu vabohu coexists with the kingdom of God. The chaotic nothingness is still here, even amidst the fullness of life. Maybe that's why both Eric and I chose to have pictures of storms, of all things, in our offices. All of us, especially when we are struggling, need a reminder that the Lord is sovereign over the tohu vabohu. But that doesn't always mean the storm will end immediately or ever, at least in this life. Just like with a storm, there's no resolution to what I have to say. As soon as a storm is over, there are messes to be cleaned up, questions to be answered, wounds to be healed. There is no such thing as a tidy ending to a storm. So as people of faith, we do not naively deny the existence of the tohu vabohu. We do not callously insist that the tohu vabohu has no power or impact at all. Rather, as disciples of Jesus, this is what we do. When we are caught in storms that threaten to overwhelm us, we trust in a God who naps on a cushion beside us. When we are caught in storms that we have no power to control, we rely on a God who has calmed the chaos before and promises to do it again. When we are caught in storms that make us feel like everything is meaningless, we know that our shelter, our refuge, our rock will eventually speak healing into our broken lives, our broken relationships, our broken communities, and our broken hearts. Peace, Jesus says. Be still.